Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me today as I talk a little bit about the natural history of Colorado's native bees. My name is Dr. Adrian Carper. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Colorado Boulder and an associate in the Museum of Natural History. I study bees, and one of the first questions that I often get asked is, what are bees? How do you tell the difference between a bee and a wasp? And basically, bees are wasps. They're derived from a superfamily of wasps. The biggest difference between a bee and a wasp is in what it eats. Most wasps are carnivorous, so they eat other insects, and most bees, of course, eat pollen. And they have structures on their body, their hairs, which are specifically designed to capture pollen. So when you look at these hairs, they're not just simple little lines. You can see that they're actually branched, much like a feather, which help them collect pollen that they use to feed their offspring. And some bees, of course, have gotten really, really hairy and are really, really good at collecting pollen. And that's really important to bees because of their associations with flowers. And there are literally thousands of different species of bees, right? Nearly 20,000 species in the world, going on 4,000 here in North America now, probably. Nearly a quarter of those here in Colorado. And one of the things I like to point out is while many people are familiar with honeybees, they actually make up a very small proportion of the biodiversity of bees, right? Only 7 species of honeybees in the entire world, and only one of those in North America, and here in Colorado, the Western or formerly European honeybee, which of course isn't native. We brought it here to pollinate our crops and to make honey, right? So today we're going to be talking about these other 945 different species in Colorado. And so I use the term bee natural history to describe kind of how bees make a living, right? And there are 2 major components of bee natural history. Of course, what they feed on, right? Because bees rely on flowers, the types of flowers in a community are really important in structuring how a bee gets its food, right? And so we use this kind of knowledge, this natural history knowledge of interactions with flowers to learn what species of plants to plant in our backyard to attract pollinators and help support their populations. But much less do we spend time talking about where bees nest, right? Because most bees don't nest like bumblebees and honeybees. They do things very, very differently, right? But having an understanding of where our wild bees or our native bees nest is really important if we want to affect their conservation. Because even if you plant tons of flowers, if you don't have a place for bees to nest, then you won't attract them to your area. And the reality is that most bees, like their wasp ancestors, nest in the ground. So ground nesting bees make up probably 70% of the species that we have in Colorado. And the reality is these things are really hard to find because just like wasps, most of them are just tiny little holes in the ground. And so from the surface, you may only see, if you're lucky, a little hole with a green or bluish head popping out of it. But underneath that little hole in the surface could be a really deep architecture of tunnels holding different chambers that house larvae or provisions where the female is storing all the pollen that she's collecting for her offspring. And so you're going to see a bunch of little grainy cell phone video, apologies, but you can actually get pretty good. If you look in early spring, this is an andrina, a mining bee, and look at the scale here. Those are pine needles beside it, only 2 to 3 millimeters across. Most of our ground nesting bees are small. This is probably a diadasia, a cactus bee. These things are really hard to spot because they're just holes in the ground and they spend very little time going in and out, just like that. But you can tell they all like open ground, and that's something that we don't really like to see in our landscapes. If you're really lucky, you may come across an aggregation where hundreds or thousands of bees nest together. This happens to be digger bees. They like vertical banks. So here's a female hanging out on the side of this vertical bank, and you're going to see something really cool happen. Boom, right there. That's a male digger bee who came in. Here it is slowed down a little bit, grabbed the female right off the side of the cliff, and then is going to tumble down and hope that he gets a chance to mate with her. And so some of these things nest in really, really huge aggregations. And you might imagine that things like vertical banks are really, really rare landscape features. And so this isn't all new information. We've been studying ground nesting bees in the CU Museum for a long time. T.D.A. Cockerell is one of the most famous names in bee taxonomy and biology. He was here at the University of of Colorado Museum of Natural History in the early 1900s. We've got lots of really cool information on him because the library have been archiving a lot of his materials, including a really cool video that was taken by Robert Niedrich, who was the curator of birds at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. He actually went out with him, as my best guess, about 1937, and filmed Cockerell and his associates looking for bees. And so here's an alkali bee, Nomia bakeri, just like those cactus bees are, digging through the soil, trying to excavate a nest. Here's his associates themselves actually excavating those nests to describe the architecture that's going sometimes 3-4 feet underground before you get to where they actually provision their offspring. Here's those digger bees, Anthophora. This is a different species. Just nests upon nests upon nests, right? Look at the density of this aggregation here. And it's really cool because he got some cool behaviors. Here you can see a female digger bee actually constructing those little intricate turrets off the front of her nest. So she's using her abdomen, mixing water with soil to make this turret, which protects the entrance of the nest. Which brings up a great point. Most people think, okay, we need pollen and nectar from the flowers, we need soil. You also got to be able to construct the nest. And so these are images of those bees actually drinking water to mix with the soil to make the plaster that they use to build the partitions within their nest. And so just like birds need bird baths, they also need bee baths, right? They need a place to be able to collect water to effectively construct their nests. And so on a large scale, this becomes really important. So I work with open spaces talking about how we identify important habitats across the landscape for bees. We know that flowers are really important, but things like this head cut off of the St. Vrain Creek can be really important habitat for bees. Those banks, while they may be an eyesore to us, create vertical banks that invite Anthophora or digger bees to come in and nest. And then you get secondary cavity nesters like leafcutter bees and mason bees, which like to nest in the old holes of those Anthophora. And so here's a little picture up close where you can see those turret from the digger bees, and then down on the bottom right, this leafcutter bee came in and nested in one of those holes. And so these things can be really important across the landscape. So here on Hall Ranch is a vertical bank that had literally thousands of different Anthophora nests and other bees nesting in it. This could be the largest habitat patch for this species across, say, a mile of different terrain, right? And so the other big group of nesting bees are cavity nesting bees. So most of our bees nest in the soil. About a third of our bees actually nest in cavities in either wood or hollow stems. And this is something that most people are somewhat aware of now because of things like blue orchard bees. But what they don't think about is that almost all of these things rely on other insects to make those cavities, right? Because bees can't chew through solid wood, but beetles do. And so here's an unfortunate metallic wood boring beetle that was predated when it left its natal cavity. And that cavity was then used by a leafcutter bee to build her nest. And so here's a time series photos that I took of this bee as she was completing her nest in that old cavity. And the reality is we know almost nothing about the relationships between bees and the beetles that make the cavities on which they depend, right? And so what we do know is that they need dead wood, right? About 30% of our bee species nest in cavities, including those in dead wood, and how we manage our wood habitat is really, really important. And so while a dead log may be an eyesore to us, it can be really, really important to bees that are looking to nest there. Of course, if you got to take out that wood, you can supplement it by putting things in like bee blocks. Most people are familiar with bee blocks or bee houses now. Here's some video that I took of a blue orchard bee. This is probably the most common bee that you'll find at your bee blocks. You can not only drill holes in wood, but you can cut up pieces of bamboo or reeds and stuff into wood to attract bees to come and nest there. And just like with the digger bees, remember, these things are using a variety of materials to construct their nest. Those are actually using mud. So just like the digger bees, mud that's made from soil and water mixed together. So we need to make sure that we have water available to our bees. And this is really cool because it allows a lot of people to be able to affect conservation in their backyards, right? Because we can make bee habitat. Not only can we plant flowers, we can make nesting habitat, right? By creating bee blocks and such. And one of the things I always like to point out to people is, unlike with bluebird houses, when you put a nest block out in your backyard, you need to leave it there for at least a few years, right? They're perfectly happy to go over winter. And so within any kind of nest, this happens to be a piece of bamboo, the female will come over the summer and provision nectar and pollen. You can see here the larvae feeding within the different partitions within this nest. And then those larvae will grow, eat all of the pollen and nectar, and they'll pupate over winter. They need cold, so don't bring these things in over winter. They're not going to freeze to death. And then the next year that they'll emerge as an adult and start the whole process again. So really the only maintenance that they need is that every few years, if they start to look kind of moldy or junky, you need to change them out for a new one, basically. And we can get lots of different types of bees in there. This is one of my favorite species of osmia, a really, really strikingly metallic blue bee, and different sizes, right? And so we need to provide a variety of sizes because we have very, very tiny bees out there, like this Ashmediella on the left, which may only be a few millimeters long versus, say, this orange-tipped cactus borer, which is quite large, nearly an inch long, right? That needs a really big cavity to nest. And so when you provide nesting habitats, it's really good to put a variety of them out there. Vary the sizes that you drill in your hole or that you drill in your wood, or put lots of different size bamboos out so that you can attract a variety of different types of bees, right? And you can get as diverse as you want to. Some people build all-out bee walls, right, where they put tons of different nesting materials out for them. And one of the things I always like to point out to people is that, again, this isn't new. You look at some towns in Europe, and people have been putting up orchard bee walls for hundreds and hundreds of years to attract bees to their orchards so that they do the pollination services for them, and we don't rely on honeybees. And so hopefully through this talk, I know it was really fast and furious and provided a lot of information, but hopefully it's convinced you that not only is planting flowers really important for bees, but also providing nesting habitat is really important as well, right? And hopefully if you have enough space, you can do a little bit of a combination of both. So thanks so much for listening. If you got any other questions, feel free and leave some comments or questions. I'll try and get back to those today. And if you got any more questions, always feel free to visit the museum. We're doing a lot of virtual stuff from online now, so reach out to us if you got any questions. Thanks so much.